what I'm trying to do here in this talk about the future commons is to get a little bit into, what is it that actually needs to be changing? So about the nitty-gritty, but I'm still talking about a big topic, and that is the question of time and temporality. And the argument that I want to make, and I'm trying to convince you that time and temporality really matters if you want to reimagine capitalism, and if you want to measure performance in a way that honors considerations around climate change, the future, our common future. And so that we really need to think about what some of these assumptions are and maybe try to rethink some of these assumptions. So stewardship of the future commons. This is joint work with Professor Mike and Schulz from Copenhagen Business School. And we are collaborating on a project around how can we make distant futures actionable. So climate change, of course, anyone who has experienced floods, extreme heat, even fires this summer, knows that, of course, it's not necessarily climate change is no longer only a distant future. And I'm citing the writer Gibson, who said the future is here already. It's just unevenly distributed. So depending on where you are, climate change is already very, very real. But I think some of the core consequences we probably we see play out in the future. So temporal assumptions, they really, really matter. They matter in terms of, if we measure performance over a particular period of time. We measure performance in a way that we have certain assumptions about time. We use clock time. We have assumptions around linear time. We have, interest rates are basically the time value of money. We use discount rates. So there are a lot of temporal assumptions that we use when we measure performance that are really, really critical of how we think about performance that also shape our behavior on markets. So this is what this is what basically trying to think about time and temporality and how this is really a central dimension of sustainability. It's something that I didn't start out with as an academic, but I did some field work where I really realized how temporality really matters. So I want to present the climate emergency as not only, but partly a temporal challenge, introduce the notion of the future commons, introduce the idea of future making, and think about how we can move away from this idea of thinking about the future as one of trade-offs to a generative interplay between different modes of future making, and how we could do this. So let's start with why climate emergency is a temporal challenge. So the world has committed to transitioning to net zero by 2050. And this is very much based on science, because science tells us that time is actually running out. Time to make real change is running out. So the science shows clearly that in order to avert the worst impacts of climate change and preserve a livable planet, global temperature increase needs to be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius and above pre-industrial levels. Emissions need to be reduced by 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. So we all know this. Which is interesting because this whole idea has has basically created a common temporal reference point in 2050 that we can converge on. And we have seen a number of net zero pledges by national governments, by regional governments, by cities, and by corporate actors. About 79% of EU and 49% of US companies have net zero targets. 67% of fossil fuel firms have net zero commitments, but there are no real phase-out plans of oil and gas. I'm part of Oxford Net Zero, which is an interdisciplinary alliance at Oxford University that is committed to using our academic expertise in the pursuit of this transition to net zero. And part of this is tracking net zero commitments. of exactly these different actors that make these commitments. But however, we also know that current policies and commitments, even if they're implemented, we don't even talk about those that, implementation is a big challenge that has been debated at COP27, that will be debated at COP28 coming up. Even if the current policies that we have are implemented, it would lead to 2.7 degrees of warming. So we're nowhere near where we have to be with our commitments. So it's a temple challenge. But there's also what I would call the tragedy of the future. And this tragedy of the future was illustrated last year at the Financial Times Moral Market Summit. There was the HSBC Global Asset Management's head of responsible investment who gave a speech. The speech was titled, "Why Investors Need Not Worry About Climate Risk." It was a very frank speech, and maybe it encapsulates some thoughts that still a lot of people on financial markets think, but maybe would not dare to speak publicly. He phrased these thoughts publicly. And in this speech he said, Rebecca talked about Florida, right? Who cares if Miami is 6 meters underwater in 100 years' time? For most companies with stranded assets, their valuation does not take anything into account that happens after about 20 years. At a bank like ours, HSBC, what do people think the average loan length is? It's 6 years. What happens to the planet in year 7 is irrelevant to our loan book. This is the tragedy of the future, that a lot of our thinking is very short-term oriented. Most businesses have strategic plans that are 3 or 5 years, and what happens afterwards, yes, it matters, but it doesn't really become relevant for immediate decision-making, for immediate behavioral challenges. So the tragedy of the future. As an academic, I always think about academic frameworks, and of course, Thomas Harden has written about the tragedy of the commons. Freedom in a commons brings ruin to all, is what he said. So we could think about the future, our collective future, as a commons challenge. So what are the commons? The commons are shared resources that are prone to overuse. Harden's example was a meadow where everybody's allowed to bring sheep to graze. And everybody has the incentive to put one more sheep there to maximize or increase the individual benefit. But if too many people overuse the shared resource, we see this with overfishing of our waters. This resource gets exploited and brings ruin to all. Once we think about our shared resources, and of course waste is also not waste, like our air, plastic pollution is also, we can think about it as a commons problem. We see a lot of commons problems out there in the world, and I want to suggest that we can also think about time and temporality, the future, as a commons. And these commons we have to exercise stewardship over in order to protect these collective resources. So Thomas Harden had a very, very negative idea of humanity, that a commons is automatically prone to overexploitation. Elinor Ostrom, the first female Nobel Prize winner in economics, had a much more positive vision about the commons and how humanity can actually manage the commons. Through what she called polycentric governance. So we'll come to this a little bit later. So let's stay on the notion of the commons. Now we can also think about lots of things as commons. We can think about physical commons like forests or water, but we can also think about intangible commons like the cultural commons, knowledge commons, and the temporal commons. So Bludon and Waller have done some research on this and define the temporal commons as the shared conceptualization of time and the set of resultant values, beliefs, and behaviors regarding time. Now, the future is, of course, an important element of time. So let's think about the future commons as an intangible shared resource. That is, if we go back to the Brundtland definition of sustainability, sustainability is what is the definition? It's protecting meeting the needs. Meeting the needs of the future generations. So it's very much the future, and this intertemporal challenge is very much part of the definition of sustainability. But also we see that in the tragedy of the future commons, the benefits accrue to present users, while aggregated harms are dispersed across future generations. And we can think about the climate strike that, of course, Greta Thunberg started here in Sweden, in Stockholm, as a protest against the erosion of the future commons, against the erosion of the future that the youth and those unborn generations that this belongs to. So the future commons as a shared resource that we have to protect. Now, what type of resource is this, and how do we protect this type of resource? Now, this kind of requires us to think a little bit differently about time and temporality and the future. And one of the quotes that I also really like, that has often been attributed to Abraham Lincoln, is the best way to predict the future is to create it. So thinking about the future, not something that we need to predict or anticipate, but something that we are actually making. We are making the future through what academics would call future-making practices. So how do we make the future? How can we think about the future as something that we make? So first of all, we need to think about the future commons not as something that is out there, but something that we create. It's socially constructed. And that's because conceptualizations of time are based on social conventions, cultural constructions, and what Zerubbabel calls socio-temporal ordering. Think about clock time. Clock time is not natural time. Our calendar is not natural time. It's an approximation of solar time, but it's not exact. So when you go to London, you can go to the Greenwich Royal Observatory, where the Greenwich Mean Time, you actually have a green laser beam that shows you the meridian. This is a kind of a social convention. We all agreed on clock time, which was introduced through the railroads, which needed to have a social convention on time. But there's nothing natural about clock time as such. So it's something that we agree to use. And so we can create and recreate, and we can potentially change these temporal structures that we live with. And so we can also think about the future as one of those temporal practices that we create and recreate and can potentially change. So the challenge is less about knowing the future, predicting the future, but questioning how we can make the future. And this draws on the idea that, we always make the future in the present. Our anticipations of the future, our imagination of the future very much influence what we do today. And in turn, these imagined futures, Jens Becker, the organizational sociologist, has written about this, that many of our financial markets, have inbuilt assumptions about the future, and are based on as-if imagined futures. They act backwards onto the present and influence of how we behave. The idea is the future commons as something we have to protect collectively, and something that it's within our power, our collective agency, to think about how we can think about this. I have previously written about temporal conflicts in relation to sustainable development. One way to conceptualize this is in terms of intertemporal conflicts. So this is from a paper by Laverty, who talked actually about innovation and who described this conflict as one, the technology that looks most promising in the beginning might not be the one that is the most promising in the long term. So, what is the best in the short run might be completely opposite from what is the best in the long run. And scholars have written about this as being really central to the sustainability challenges, that there's a tension between short futures, long futures, near and distant futures. And I think that's a very important way to think. But I also think we can think about these different long-term and short-term futures more as an interplay, because whenever we interact, we always have a short and a long-term future in mind simultaneously. I think about in a conversation, we think about turn-taking in a conversation, but we also think about maybe the broader trajectory of this interaction or where this is going, or the future projects and plans we have. So maybe we can think about these interplays and how these interplays can become more generative. And to produce a shared imagination for the future really matters for coordinating our action in the present. One way to think about this is to think about, this draws on some research by Temporal and Ilyasov on the different types of futures, the present moment, the more midterm and the long term. They think about this in chronological terms, and how we can kind of create more coordination between these different temporal horizons. Now, what I want to do is to kind of challenge us even a little bit further and think about very different ways of construing the future. So we can think about interplay of multiple modes of future making. And as an academic, I like, business school academic. I like 2x2s because it really helps me organize thoughts. But I think it's kind of a, generative as a thought exercise. So we can think about the future as the near future. And that's not necessarily the chronological near future, but the near future as something that we can more imagine as we can imagine the details about this, versus the distant future that seems much more cognitively removed. And in the COVID pandemic, even tomorrow's future could look very distant, right? So it's not necessarily chronological. So it very matters of how we construe the future as something that is near to us or something that is rather distant. But then I also want to challenge you about the directionality of the future. Typically, we think about the future as something flowing from the past into the present, into the future, right? We have like a directionality in mind. So a forward projection from the present to the future. Now, we can also reverse this. And that's something that, some scholars have drawn quantum physics to actually think about a reverse directionality of time. So we see the future as something more that is coming towards us. And I think that's something that resonates when we talk about climate change and temporality. The catastrophe of climate change is something that is coming towards us. The resource constraints are something that is coming towards us. We don't know yet what it is, but we see it's coming towards us. And it also means that we know we can't project forward because the future is going to look very different from the present. It's no longer a mirror of the present, but there is real uncertainty about how this future is going to look like. There are these critical thresholds, tipping points that really question what this is going to be. So, and then we can think about maybe the near future as a forward projection is maybe something that we find most comfortable with. The future of making business plans, the future of strategic planning, something that is, we can imagine how this future might look like. The more distant future in a forward projection could be that around, for instance, the socioeconomic pathways. We could project them on the basis of different assumptions that we make, and this is the IPCC climate pathways, which kind of gives us a trajectory that provides some really important guidance about the distant future based on certain assumptions that we make today. But we could also think about if we see the future as more something coming towards us. I signed up for the very first time for the Oxford Half Marathon. I'm a bit scared because I've never run a half marathon in my life. So wish me luck in 2 weeks' time. But I think one thing that very motivates one in projects, or I think that's what's going to motivate me as I run, is kind of imagining the end of it. So imagining the end of it and then kind of working backwards, imagining the event as something that has already happened and that guides action in the present. This is kind of a reverse of the future. We kind of think more about the future, the end coming towards us. if we think about this temporality, but in the distant future, this brings us more to kind of distant future imaginaries. Ecotopias, my colleague Annette Mikes works on the ministry for the future. And probably that's what we need more of. We need kind of these distant future imaginaries of what could be. And this is also a challenge for us as academics, because what we do is we work with empirical data. But empirical data is passed as soon as we're able to collect it. So, who's going to imagine these new desirable futures that can then inspire action in the present? So I just want us to think about different ways of how we can approach the future, of how we can deal with the future. And I just want to make a suggestion how sustainability reporting, coming to the world of measuring performance, actually is going to challenge us in the way we think about time and temporality. So I think it's a new paradigm for corporate future orientation, where some of these more academic-sounding conceptions of the futures actually become real. And the first is that it challenges us to think, or to rethink, a world of infinite resources where we can project, future cash flows as if there was infinite growth. But now we face a world of finite resources. Again, Swedish research, the planetary boundaries, I think, is a very, very powerful way that really shows us what the planetary boundaries are, that really mean that we operate within a finite world that has critical thresholds. And also interdependencies. So when Rebecca mentioned that the Walmart's share price dropped by 20%, that is only an individual company's perspective. The community value of people getting paid more is of course rising, but we don't measure these interdependencies. But once we think about a finite world, and if only one company reduces greenhouse gas emissions, of course it doesn't change the systemic climate risk that still exists on markets. So it really challenges us to think from kind of, an assumptions of, an infinite world to a finite world. It also moves us from looking backwards to being inherently forward-looking. So financial accounting typically based on past profit and loss. And now the new paradigm really forces us to think about future risks and opportunities. And that is very different, because some of these climate risks, we can't really predict them. So it really is beyond kind of what we know from the past. And what are the new opportunities that arise in such a world? And if the future no longer mirrors the past, we can't rely on this mode of projecting forward from the past to imagine what the future will be. And that also kind of challenges us to think from forward projection to working backwards, reversing the flow of time. So now what sustainability reporting asks companies to do is to think about setting targets, like net zero commitments, but then also more midterm targets in their transition plans. And then we measure performance against these targets as opposed to past performance. So suddenly we think about future targets becoming a measure for performance. This is some work that I'm doing with my colleague Richard Barker, who's been seconded to the International Sustainability Standards Board. And so we've had many discussions around how this really challenges our assumptions around time and temporality. Okay, so I just want to conclude here with a summary of these thoughts around how we have to change our thinking about the future, not as an inexhaustible resource, but as a commons that requires stewardship. And that also challenge us to think about interdependence between future makers. What is the emerging governance architecture for exercising the stewardship of the commons? What are the temporal assumptions that we need to change in how we measure performance and how we use time? Can we discount the future is that that was a big debate in the Stern report for climate change, if you remember, in 2007. What is the adequate discount rate that we use? Okay, this is my own timer, so I'm ahead of time. And how can we build this into the ways that we measure performance of companies and other organizations? And I think this will then also hopefully help us to think about future making and the tools through which we make the future that foster these not trade-offs but generative dynamics between near futures and distant futures, and being forward projecting but also working backwards to distant futures that we imagine and what this means for our behavior today. And I will stop here and allow some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you. Fantastic. So let's open up. Thank you so much, Juliane. Let's open up for questions, comments. Yes.
Hi. Thank you very much for the presentation.
You can say the name.
I'm Gianluca Delfino. I'm assistant professor here at SSE, the accounting department. Thank you very much. And I very much appreciate the presentation and this forward-looking. But I work in psychology, right? I use some psychological theories, and I know the importance of incentives. So how would incentives work, or how do you envision incentives for the future to enable people to just, do the right thing, right? And sorry for if I'm talking too much, but another thing is the difficulty in measuring things, right? So how do we build the incentives on things that are difficult to measure? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think this is critical because I think now our incentive is to be very short-term oriented. Quarterly reporting, for instance, or annual reporting, and so on. So this really focuses on, what's good in the short term. So once we have built in a much longer-term perspective, then the incentive to look into the future and look at longer-term consequences becomes much more prevalent. So I think what is interesting, there are a number of kind of legislative measures. So Wales has legislation on the rights of future generations that now the government has to take into account when they make more new policy, which is very interesting because that creates an incentive to think about how any decision today will impact future generations. There's some lawsuits that are going on where young generations are actually challenging governments to take into account their rights. So I think that's kind of more thinking about how do we build this into policy making, but kind of thinking about what are the instruments and tools of how we bring kind of how we make the future relevant for how we make policy, but also business decisions today is absolutely key.
Mm-hmm. Very good. More questions? Yeah. It's over there. Yes, please, of course.
Yeah, thank you very much, both of you. Jan Artem, Executive Director of the Inner Development Goals. Mm-hmm. So I think we're starting to swallow the bitter pill that this is the future and the risks that we're seeing. What I see, one of the pills we haven't swallowed fully yet is that the climate change is an adaptive challenge that basically requires us to change, us to grow, us to develop. And I just wanted you to speak a little bit, and I'm so happy that there is a Minister of Future Generations in Wales. I've actually met them. How do we take into account the people we are today and the people we ought to be if we are to face these challenges?
Is your question about how do we motivate people today to think about
No, basically, do we have the skills, capabilities, capacities, do you think, today in the leaders? Or do we need to develop the leaders we have or choose other leaders that have more of these skills to take the future into consideration?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that's a formidable challenge for business school, right? Because we are in the right place to actually think about this and think about, what are the new generations of leaders that we want to educate and what are the skills that we need to build to give them on the way. Yeah, I completely agree.
And what do we do with the grown-ups we have today who we can't educate in our...
I don't know. We'll have a wonderful panel with some of the grown-up CFOs here, and hopefully they will share some of their thinking later.
I have another suggestion actually for that question, and that is, I mean, first of all, it's a great luxury to first listen to Rebecca and you, Juliane, and fantastic inspiration to do. And but coming back to what we should do now is actually to have a coffee break. So that's what I suggest now. And my suggestion is that we are standing up, stretch our legs, and there are coffee served in the banana room. But make sure to be back at 3 o'clock again. So a big thank you first to Juliane. Thank you.
Thank you so much.